Hello everyone, welcome to the 2021 Freilich Lecture in Bigotry and Tolerance. Thank you for joining us. This year I am delighted to welcome Professor Sharon Nepstad from the University of New Mexico to speak on the subject of Beyond Enmity, Finding Hope in a Time of High Conflict. I am Dr. Melissa Lovell, Research Fellow at the Australian National University and convener of the Herbert and Valmae Freilich Project for the Study of Bigotry at the ANU. I would like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the Canberra region and to all First Nations Australians on whose traditional lands we are meeting. I also pay my respects to any elders who are here with us today. For over 20 years, the Freilich Project for the Study of Bigotry has sought to contribute to our understanding of the history, causes and impact of bigotry. The annual Freilich Lecture was the first regular event organised by the Freilich Project, with the inaugural lecture held in 1997. And each year since, expert speakers from different professions and disciplines have presented on the important themes of bigotry and tolerance. As a distinguished professor of sociology at the University of New Mexico in the United States and the 2021 recipient of the Robin M. Williams Jr. Distinguished Career Award from the American Sociological Association, Sharon Nepstad is well qualified to deliver this year's Freilich Lecture. She's also the author or co-author of 6 books and dozens of articles that focus on social movements, non-violence and civil resistance, peace studies, and the sociology of religion. This year, we are very pleased to include the Freilich Lecture as one of the keynote addresses of the Conference of the Australian Association for the Study of Religion, or AASR. Professor Nepstad will be speaking for about 30 to 40 minutes. There will be an opportunity to ask her questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Everyone, please welcome Professor Sharon Nepstad.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen here quickly. All right, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. We are in a moment of high conflict, and there are overt expressions of hostility in numerous spheres of life. There are political hostilities. In the US in the early 2021, several thousand people were angry enough about Joe Biden's presidential victory that they invaded the US Congress, threatening to hang the vice president and murder the Speaker of the House. Tens of thousands of people are protesting government COVID mandates, which have recently erupted into riots in places like the Netherlands and elsewhere. In Eastern Europe, we're seeing a surge of popularity in leaders like Hungary's Viktor Orban, who've gained popularity for their policies that denigrate immigrants and LGBTQ citizens. We also know that racial hostilities are escalating. African Americans who've experienced police brutality and vigilantism throughout US history have been expressing more public outrage in recent years, and with good reason. In early 2020, Ahmaud Arbery, a 25-year-old Black man, was jogging in his neighborhood. 3 white men who suspected that he trespassed on a construction site followed him in their truck and shot him in the street. 3 months after Arbery's death, George Floyd died when police officers arrested him and knelt on his neck, resulting in asphyxiation. When the video of his murder went viral, protests erupted in hundreds of cities worldwide. We're also seeing an escalation in religious hostilities. In 2019, in New Zealand, a gunman entered 2 mosques and opened fire on worshippers, killing 51. In Myanmar, the military has lethally cracked down on the Rohingya Muslims, forcing tens of thousands to flee their country. And in Afghanistan, the fundamentalist Taliban have recently regained power and are reinstituting Sharia law that significantly restricts women's rights. In light of all these tensions, it's very easy to feel discouraged. So where do we find hope? At such moments, I found myself returning to and reflecting upon those individuals who were in destructive conflicts and responded in a way that was transformative. And I think about how was it that someone like Martin Luther King Jr. was able to speak about love when people not only hated him during his lifetime, but actually tried on multiple occasions to kill him for advocating for African Americans' human rights? And how is it that someone like Nelson Mandela could emerge from 27 years of imprisonment, where he endured humiliating treatment, to take on political leadership of South Africa that was not at all tinged with bitterness? In fact, he famously invited his jailer to his presidential inaugural dinner. How could Mandela's friend and colleague, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, speak about forgiveness after hearing horrific stories of torture and abuse during the apartheid era from those who testified in South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission? How did he manage to reconcile with those who had committed the most heinous crimes against humanity? How could Lima Gaboe, an organizer of the women's peace movement during Liberia's civil war, welcome back into society the warlords and soldiers who had committed so many atrocities against civilians? How did Gandhi resist the temptation to depict British colonizers as enemies, even though they were exploiting his country and leaving millions destitute? How did he manage to fight a war against them without dehumanizing the British and insisting that they would leave the country on good terms? As I've been thinking about these different religious peacemakers and others that are part of this project I'm working on right now, I've come to the conclusion that there's something in the religious worldview and the moral imagination of these individuals that leads them to a different way of responding to conflict. And so the questions that I'm going to pose in today's presentation and that are part of this bigger project I'm working on are, first of all, what are the beliefs and values that comprise the moral imagination of those who refuse to see others as their enemies? And secondly, how does the moral imagination of peacebuilders differ from those who promote enmity and conflict? Now, before I address these questions, I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about the nature of conflict. And what is important to recognize is that conflict is something we cannot eradicate. It's just an inherent part of social and human life. Moreover, it's important to remember that conflict isn't necessarily bad. Sometimes conflict can be very productive, leading to new laws or policies that reduce inequality, that protect civil and human rights. For example, conflict can generate movements that eliminate various forms of structural violence, such as slavery and segregation. And even interpersonal conflict, when handled well, can increase the empathy and the understanding between spouses, family members, and co-workers. Yet sometimes conflict becomes highly destructive and generates animosity, distrust, hatred, and sometimes even violence. But we need to remember, conflict itself is neutral. It's really how we handle conflict that determines whether the outcome is good or bad. If it's dependent on how we handle a conflict, then it raises the question, what are the factors that take a conflict and put it onto a destructive path? Because there have been so many deeply toxic and polarizing conflicts in recent years, we have a lot of different scholars and public thinkers who have really investigated and highlighted some of the factors that we know can contribute to a destructive outcome. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time just briefly summarizing some of these factors because they provide a useful counterpart when we think about the beliefs and the moral imagination of religious peacemakers. One factor that's associated with a destructive conflict outcome deals with rigid group boundaries. Now, group identities are often rooted in our ethnicity, our religion, our political ideologies, our vocations, and these can be very valuable. Such identities give people a sense of community, a sense of belonging and meaning. But we know from decades of social psychological research that group boundaries, particularly rigid ones, can become the source of bigotry and differential treatment. And social psychologists have conducted experiments in which they show that these dynamics hold true even when they artificially created groups based on some kind of arbitrary factors, such as a coin toss. Once those group boundaries are established, the research shows that people very quickly develop an in-group bias and a more punitive approach to out-group members. Now, not all group identities and boundaries become conflictual. It has to be mixed with other factors. And one of those other factors is what we're now calling conflict entrepreneurs. Amanda Ripley wrote this book, High Conflict, and she uses the term conflict entrepreneur to refer to leaders who thrive upon and intentionally stoke intergroup conflicts. They deploy group identities to mobilize them for various purposes, and they make conflict feel exhilarating, and it provides a sense of mission and purpose. Ripley wrote, conflict entrepreneurs talk about conflict like it's a religion unto itself, a way to make sense of the world and our place in it, a sacred flame that must never be extinguished. And we can easily think about examples through history in which people have been able to mobilize group identities for such purposes, whether it's Adolf Hitler mobilizing an Aryan identity, Osama bin Laden mobilizing a Muslim identity, or Karl Marx mobilizing a proletariat identity. But what makes them influential? How do they gain influence? And why are people drawn into a conflict entrepreneur's tensions that can be toxic? One of the things we know is that conflict entrepreneurs tend to use very melodramatic rhetoric that intensifies intergroup differences, creates a sense of urgency, and it simplifies a conflict. It tends to erase any ambiguity, and this kind of grandiose language clarifies everything. It washes away important details. It energizes people to fight, to sacrifice, to ignore the costs of toxic conflict. We also know that conflict entrepreneurs tend to promote binary thinking. And while their while their rhetoric offers assurance and clarity, it also creates this problematic way of thinking that transforms in-groups and out-groups into us versus them, into good versus evil. Binary thinking presumes that your side is right and the other side is completely wrong. And we know that this is very appealing when we're faced with a complicated situation. When we face complex conflicts, we're prone to this binary thinking because our capacity to see different perspectives diminishes. Research shows that our thinking becomes less flexible and our emotional capacities are also restricted. It becomes really difficult to simultaneously feel frustration and anger at someone on the other side of the conflict, but also empathy and compassion for them. And we find ourselves quite averse to these kind of contradictory feelings. It's difficult to tolerate dissonance. So when we experience these kind of contradictions, we seek ways to alleviate it. And binary thinking offers this oversimplified worldview, an oversimplified explanation that eradicates those contradictions. But we also know that binary thinking leads people to become less tolerant and more dogmatic. Another component that can transform a conflict to have a destructive outcome are what we refer to as the social functions of the enemy. Now, having an enemy can actually be compelling and captivating. And this might sound counterintuitive because most of us do not want to have enemies. But what we see is that enemies serve various social functions. One function is that they generate internal group cohesion. So we know this, when a country is under attack from a foreign force, people will set aside their internal differences in order to unite and defend their country. But we see this kind of dynamic, this social function of the enemy, playing out in other places as well. Take, for example, the Egyptian uprising of 2011. In the Egyptian uprising, you had Muslims and Coptic Christians working together to oust President Hosni Mubarak. And they began to have a great deal of unity that hadn't existed before. For example, Coptic Christians decided that they would link hands and create a protective wall around their Muslim protester counterparts so that they could pray safely on Fridays, their holy day. The Muslim protesters then reciprocated, encircling their Christian counterparts who wanted to celebrate Mass on Sundays. And this happened despite the fact that two religious groups had a long-standing history of animosity, including a shooting on Christmas Eve just a month earlier that had left 23 Christians dead and 100 injured. So having this common enemy of Hosni Mubarak generated new unity between old conflicting groups. Another function of enemies is that they enable our groups to become moral heroes. In the battle between good and evil, we become the advocates for righteousness. And this gives us a sense of importance, self-esteem, and purpose. In his book on religious terrorism, Mark Juergensmeyer noted that this is a very powerful pull. He wrote, if we demonize those people who have excluded and oppressed us, we can help restore our damaged self-esteem. We become good, they become evil. Demonization gives us a sense of purpose as well. We're fighting evil. What could be more meaningful than that? So while having an enemy can create these valuable social functions for a group, we also know that it creates problems. With enmity, the abstract concept of evil now becomes concrete in a specific group. Moreover, people's thinking about their enemies becomes resistant to evidence that contradicts the view that they're evil. And this in-group becomes then more dogmatic in their convictions, less tolerant, and this can lead ultimately to dehumanization of their opponents. And once dehumanization occurs, we know that the worst forms of discrimination and abuse and violence can follow. The last factor I want to mention is religion. religion can intensify conflicts even further. We know from studies of religious terrorism, from holy wars, and we have a great deal of research on religious terrorists ever since the last 2 decades after 9/11 in 2001. And what we know is that when people perceive religious elements to a conflict, it can intensify it and add fuel to the fire. That's because when people believe that the conflict they're waging is a divine mandate, they're unwilling to negotiate, since one should never compromise the will of God. Furthermore, if they begin to see earthly conflicts as a reflection of a sacred cosmic battle, then individuals no longer an individual trait, but a characteristic of an entire group. And if that group is perceived to be unredeemable, then the only option to get rid of this evil in the world is to eliminate them. Whatever means are needed to accomplish such religious goals are believed to be justified because it's done to fulfill God's will. In other words, religion can lift the limits on fighting. It can assuage moral qualms about excessive force, and it can justify the most egregious acts. Now, of course, not all religious traditions promote such dynamics, and there's a rich history of religious groups who have used nonviolence to address a wide array of societal injustices. And so we have this kind of dual dynamic of religion. On the one hand, religion can be a force that demonizes other people, but on the other hand, it can humanize people. How is it that religion can both foment destructive conflict and constructively resolve conflict? How does it generate hatred for enemies, but also is a force that can foster reconciliation between enemies? So I have been thinking about these aspects, and I've been studying a number of different religious peacemakers, looking to figure out what is it about their approaches to conflict that is constructive. And I'm arguing that there's something in the moral imagination of religious peacemakers that minimizes these destructive dynamics of conflict. It reduces dynamics of enmity, and it promotes more constructive outcomes. So what I have done is to try to discern some of the aspects of this moral imagination that brings a different approach to conflict. And I've done a comparative inductive analysis of the writings and speeches of about a dozen influential peacebuilders, and these of course include the typical ones you would expect: Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., but also Thich Nhat Hanh, Desmond Tutu, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And despite the differences in their geographies, in their religious traditions, and even in the nature of their conflicts, what I found is that there are several commonalities in their belief systems. So what I focus on in particular are the following: the views that they hold on the nature of good and evil, the views on the nature of truth, their views on the nature of religion, and finally, their views on the nature of humanity. So let me begin by looking at these peacemakers' views on the nature of good and evil. Now, as I just mentioned, in a destructive conflict, people tend to view their group as good and the out-group as bad, and there's very little ambiguity. In contrast, religious peacebuilders argue that the line between good and evil is not between groups, but within each individual. And once we can acknowledge that each of us is capable of evil, the basis for self-righteousness and group moral superiority is eliminated. It becomes very difficult to condemn others for the weaknesses that we ourselves possess. So Martin Luther King wrote, "There's some good in the worst of us, and there's some evil in the best of us." And when we discover this, we're less prone to hate our enemies. Now, I'm going to just draw out a few examples across different religious leaders that illustrate these points. And I'd like to draw on the work of Thich Nhat Hanh. He's best known to most people as the leader of the engaged Buddhist movement. He's from Vietnam. He was traveling during the Vietnam War to speak about the conflict there and was not allowed to return. He settled in France, and people began to write to him about the conflicts that they were experiencing. And when they wrote to him, they were describing really evil circumstances, situations of grave injustices. And yet, he constantly resists the urge to simplify it and come up with a clear-cut binary approach of one side being completely innocent and good and the other side being irredeemably evil. So I'm going to pull up one story that he wrote about where somebody wrote to him, and he says, "There are many young girls, boat people, who are raped by sea pirates. Even though the United Nations and many countries try to help the government of Thailand prevent this kind of sea piracy, sea pirates continue to inflict much suffering on refugees. One day we received a letter telling us about a young girl on a small boat who was raped by a pirate. She was only 12 and she jumped into the ocean and drowned herself. He goes on and says, when you first learn of something like this, you get angry at the pirate and you naturally take the side of the girl. As you look more deeply, you will see it differently. If you take the side of the little girl, then it's easy. You only have to take a gun and shoot the pirate. In my meditation, I saw that if I had been born in the village of the pirate and raised in the same conditions that he was, there's a great likelihood that I would become a pirate. I saw that many babies are born along the Gulf of Siam, and if we educators, social workers, politicians, and others do not do something about the situation, in 25 years, a number of them will become sea pirates. If you and I were born today in those fishing villages, we might become sea pirates in 25 years. If you take a gun and shoot the pirate, you shoot all of us, because all of us are to some extent responsible for this state of affairs. So here he's not only pushing back on this binary approach to good and evil, but he's also saying once we can get past that, we're able to look at the root causes. Evil behavior is a symptom of underlying problems. And if we're only punishing the person who commits those injustices, we're only addressing the symptomatic behavior. If we want it to truly end, we have to look at the underlying roots of the injustice. And then we are all responsible for it. Let me move on and talk about these peacemakers' views on the nature of truth. Conflict entrepreneurs assert that they're the guardians of an unchanging absolute truth. Protecting this truth is of paramount importance. So this view of truth prioritizes ideas over people. In contrast, religious peacebuilders believe that this mindset is dangerous because it leads to a readiness to harm others in the name of protecting truth. So they place the emphasis on humanity, on people over ideas. Here again, I'm drawing from the work of Thich Nhat Hanh, where he says, if you have an ideology and you stick to it, thinking it is the absolute truth, you can kill millions, and humankind suffers very much from attachment to views. In the name of truth, we kill each other. For religious peacebuilders, then, instead of viewing themselves as protectors of the truth, they view themselves as pursuers of the truth. Truth is something you strive for. It's not something that anyone possesses completely. And recognizing the limits of our own knowledge then is important because it counters dogmatism and it undercuts that binary thinking. And here again, we see this is a common theme across all these peacebuilders. Here's Archbishop Desmond Tutu saying we must be ready to learn from another, not claiming that we alone possess all truth and that somehow we have a corner on God. Now, this idea of pursuing truth and the truth being an essential way of transforming conflict in a constructive manner is really well exemplified by Gandhi. And for Gandhi, he argued that truth is God. Not that God is truth, as we commonly hear, but that truth is God. And since humans do not know God completely, then they do not possess absolute truth, and they're not in a position where they're able to punish other people. This is really the heart of Gandhi's philosophy of satyagraha. And this was a concept that you often hear translated as truth force. Sometimes you'll hear it translated as soul force. Many people argue that the best translation is clinging to the truth. And Gandhi argued that this was the fundamental kind of way that he was going to address, at that time, British occupation of India. And he argued that they would fight with the truth. And the idea was that they would, both in word and in action, continue to persuade the British that it was in everyone's best interest to leave because British occupation and colonialism was unjust and oppressive. But the other aspect of satyagraha is that you have to invite your opponents to persuade you of their truths. So you're working on persuading your opponent, but you have to remain unceasingly open as they try to persuade you of their truths, of their positions. And the idea here is really a synthesis. And so some people, namely Joan Bondurant in her well-known book, Conquest of Violence, she's called this the Gandhian Dialectic because it's very similar to what we know as the Hegelian dialectic, where one party asserts a thesis, the other side has an opposing view, the antithesis, and it is in that dialogue, in that back and forth, that if both sides remain open, you can reach a synthesis that integrates the perspectives and the best knowledge of both sides. This is not the same as coercion, nor is it the same as compromise. And people often think that it's about compromise. And Gandhi was very clear that you should never compromise on what you believe to be true. You only change your mind when you see the truth of the other side. So here's Bondrat's explanation of this dialectic. She says, what's resulting from the dialectical process of conflict of opposite positions as acted upon by Satyagraha is a synthesis, not a compromise. The Satyagrahi is never prepared to yield any position which he holds to be truth. He is, however, prepared, and this is essential, to be persuaded by his opponent that the opponent's position is the true or more nearly true position. And when persuasion has been effected, what was once the opposite of the opponent's position is the position now of both antagonist and protagonist. There's no victory in the sense of triumph of one side over another. There's no lowering of demands, but an aiming at a higher level of adjustment, which creates a new, mutually satisfactory resolution. Now, when people use this notion of pursuing the truth, there's numerous benefits that can be seen from it. For example, groups, when they recognize that their point of view is incomplete, that makes them reluctant to use violence because there's always the possibility that they could be wrong. We also see that this approach turns one's enemy or opponent now into a partner. It's a group effort to try to transform the conflict. So your opponent is not a wicked enemy who needs to be punished, but a partner in bringing about change. We also know that when groups take this type of approach and come to a point of synthesis, sharing similar views, that the solution or resolution of their conflict is much more likely to endure over time. And that's because we often see in conflict situations that one side coerces the other side. They capitulate. They end up saying we give up, but they haven't really had a transformation in their thinking. And often what occurs is resentment continues and re-erupts later. And this is why we have very high rates of civil wars re-erupting after peace agreements have been signed, because that resentment still is there. Let me move on and talk about these peacemakers' views on the nature of religion. The views of faith-based peace builders are fundamentally different than religious conflict entrepreneurs. If we think about religious terrorists, for example, whether they're members of Al-Qaeda or Christian abortion clinic bombers or Hindu supremacists, religion is viewed as an end in and of itself. Religion is an end goal, whether it's the bringing in of a theocracy or the implementation of religious laws and practices to govern daily life. The belief is that people then can be sacrificed in order to establish and preserve that religious foothold in society. In contrast, we see that religious peace builders see religion as a means to an end. They see it as a guiding system to help one reach greater spirituality or knowledge, but it is not the end in and of itself. Here again, I'm going to draw some examples. This comes from a conversation, a book that documents a conversation between Thich Nhat Hanh and Daniel Berrigan, a Jesuit priest from the US. And Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, "Religious teaching is merely a vehicle to describe the truth. Do not mistake it for the truth itself. Buddhist teaching is only a raft to help you across the shore. The raft is needed, but the raft is not the shore. A finger pointing to the moon is not the moon. The finger is needed to know where to look for the moon, but if you mistake it for the moon itself, you will never know the moon." And of course, this idea was also present in Gandhi's writings. He said, religions are different roads converging to the same point. And what does it matter if we take different roads so long as we reach the same goal? If a man reaches the heart of his own religion, he's reached the heart of the others also. So long as there are different religions, every one of them may need some distinct symbol. But when the symbol is made into a fetish and an instrument of proving the superiority of one's religion over others, it is only fit to be discarded. I'd like to move on and talk about views on the nature of humanity. For religious conflict entrepreneurs, evil cannot be transformed. Therefore, the only option to eliminate it from the world is to destroy it. But for religious peace builders, the goal is not punishment, but redemption. The goal is to restore humanity. And the belief is that all people are redeemable. Here I'm going to draw on the ideas of Daniel Berrigan. He wrote, "The Christian, if he follows Christ's example, will constantly want to cross over and be with the excommunicated or with the stigmatized, the so-called enemy. For those who belong to the radical religious community, I don't care whether it's located in East or West, whether it's Christian or Buddhist, There's a constant insistence that whatever judgments are rendered, they're not retributive so much as redemptive. Mercy is the point. We're trying to say, even to those who in the name of the law or in the name of power commit the most awful actions against others, we're declaring that those people are redeemable too. The last example I'm going to draw on comes from the women's peace movement in Liberia. And this movement was very essential in bringing the different warring parties to the negotiation table, signing the peace accords and implementing it. But they realized that their work was not done once the peace accords had been signed. And in fact, they realized that one of the biggest issues they needed to face is how they were going to reincorporate all of these ex-combatants back into civil society. These were people who had committed terrible atrocities against the civilian population, but they knew that if they rejected them, if they continued to have these tensions, that the country's peace was very, very fragile. And they decided that they had to look for the humanity in them. So here's a quote from the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Lema Gbowie. She said, "What we did is we engaged in real relationships with the child soldiers. We saw them not as perpetrators of violence, but as sons and daughters. We ate food together, we laughed and cried together. We had to rehumanize them in their powerlessness. We had to take away not only their guns, but also their vulnerability. We had to give them a new kind of power. In the presence of their mothers, the children no longer found power in their guns, but in their relationship. We took away their fear and gave them a new kind of boldness through love." So I've summarized some of the commonalities that these religious peace builders have in terms of their views of good and evil, of religion, the nature of truth, and of the nature of humanity. But what can we glean from that? These are all conflicts that have happened at different time periods and different locations. How can we take lessons from what they have learned through their experiences and implement them in the conflicts that we face today? There's many more lessons that we can drive. I just want to highlight a few. One is the importance of dialogue. Dialogue in that Gandhian sense of the Gandhian dialectic and satyagraha. And when we engage in real dialogue, we're countering that binary thinking and we're complicating the narrative. We're saying we're rejecting a very simplistic, oversimplistic interpretation and trying to understand those underlying root causes that are giving rise to this conflict. Now, what's really important here is to emphasize dialogue rather than debate. And frankly, I think this is something that many of our cultures have lost the art of doing dialogue. And I'm going to draw on a quote from Peter Coleman, who just released a book this year called This Way Out. And he talks about the important difference between dialogue and debate. Most of us engage in debate, but to truly be in that pursuit of truth, to truly try to identify those underlying root causes of the conflict that enable us to address those rather than the mere symptoms, the evil behavior, the unjust behavior, we have to do dialogue. Here's his explanation of the difference between dialogue and debate. Debate involves scoring points and winning an argument. It involves making a solid case for your original position and then listening attentively to the other side to identify flaws in their logic or find evidence that you can cite to bolster your own. It also involves spewing as much information as you can for as long as possible to wear down your adversary. Dialogue is the opposite. It involves significantly more opening, sharing, discovering, and learning. When in dialogue, participants often learn new information about themselves, the others involved, and the issues. The power of dialogue comes from two simple sources: hearing others and being heard. A second point is that we have to, in our movements, in our groups, learn to lean into rather than avoid ambiguity and contradictions. In our own perspectives, in the conflicts, in the information that we're receiving. And here, I think we can learn a lesson from Megan Phelps Roper. Megan Phelps Roper was raised in the Westboro Baptist Church here in the United States. This is a church that's well known because of its inflammatory hate speech, because of its hostile protests against LGBTQ people, Muslims, Jews, and others. And Phelps Roper was the granddaughter of the person who started this church, and she was raised in this from infancy, starting to join in protests at the age of 5. She wholeheartedly believed the teachings of the Westboro Baptist Church. It was only in her 20s that she began to change. And ironically, this change started because other Christians on Twitter, Twitter's not usually a place that we think of as really having authentic dialogue, But she found Christians on Twitter who were pointing out the contradictions between the hateful protests that she and her church were engaged in and the gospel teachings on mercy and love and compassion. And she began to see those contradictions. And as soon as she started to explore them, her clarity, the certainty of her simplistic good versus evil worldview began to unravel. In her book entitled Unfollow, a memoir of loving and leaving the Westboro Baptist Church, she wrote, "My friends on Twitter took the time to understand Westboro's doctrines, and in doing so, they were able to find inconsistencies that I'd missed my entire life. Why did we advocate for the death penalty for gays when Jesus said, 'Let he who is without sin cast the first stone'? How could we claim to love our neighbor while at the same time praying for God to destroy them? The truth is that the care shown to me by these strangers on the internet was itself a contradiction. It was growing evidence that people on the other side were not the demons I'd been led to believe." Within months, she and her sister left this religious community. Now, the final lesson that I'd like to mention today is, I think, the importance of humanizing when others are being demonized. And here I'd like to draw an example of the US sanctuary movement of the 1980s. And here's a picture of the founder of the US sanctuary movement. That's Jim Corbett in the picture, in the center of the picture there. Jim Corbett's a Quaker from Tucson, Arizona. And in 1980, he began to notice there was a massive influx of Central Americans, mostly from El Salvador, Guatemala, coming across the border. And they were coming to the United States because they were fleeing human rights abuses and persecution in their home countries. But this was the height of the Cold War era. This was when President Ronald Reagan was arguing that Central Americans posed the greatest threat to US national security because of the revolutionary struggles in the region. Ronald Reagan implemented massive financial and military aid programs to these regimes, even though they were responsible for these human rights abuses that included torture, disappearances, and executions of anyone who questioned the social inequalities in these countries. So these refugees were coming to the United States, and they were trying to apply for asylum because the US claims that it will uphold a person who has a well-founded fear of persecution, their right to find asylum in a country when they are fleeing that persecution. But overwhelmingly, they were denied asylum. They were sent back, often to their deaths in Central America. So Jim Corbett said, this isn't going to work. We cannot work within the system. And as a Quaker, he put out a call to Quaker communities throughout the US and said, this is our tradition. We were involved in the Underground Railroad in the abolitionist era when people brought slaves from the South and brought them to the North to freedom. He said it is time to relaunch the Underground Railroad. And he began smuggling Central Americans across the border. And these faith communities then took them in, declared their communities a sanctuary that was not open to immigration officers, that they were declaring it a sacred area where they would protect these immigrants. And what happened is they had to transport these immigrants to all these different communities. So they would drive throughout the country, and along the way, they would stop at synagogues, they would stop at Catholic and Protestant churches, and they would have these refugees tell their stories. They tell their stories, and that humanized these people who we'd been told were a threat to our US national security. I'm going to quote a couple of activists who talked about the power of humanizing these people that we were told were enemies. One woman said, "Here were people in our churches, in our living rooms, and they were telling us what it means to see your brother killed or your mother raped. I became aware of this cognitive dissonance, and I wondered, why is our government sending all this money to a place where people are being slaughtered? I knew we had to do something." Another activist said, the sanctuary movement was ingenious because with the network of churches that developed through this Underground Railroad, you had refugees that were moving into communities all over the country and telling their stories. These were compelling stories. They gave a human face to the reality in Central America, to the foreign policy debate that was happening in Washington, D.C. It also taught people about something about the contradictions in their own government. A lot of folks saw the injustice of the situation, and that became the basis for mass mobilizing. So to wrap this up, I think what we can learn from these religious peace builders is that when we're willing to engage in authentic and open dialogue, when we're willing to explore the contradictions in our own views and in the information that we receive about our opponents, when we humanize those that we're told are our enemies, then we will be promoting constructive conflict. That is when we will be offering hope in a time of high conflict. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Sharon. There is a lot to think through, and I'm sure we'll have some questions coming through shortly. For those of you who are wondering how to ask a question, if you look at the bottom of your screen in Zoom, there's a Q&A button there that you can press and type in your question. I have a couple of questions coming through now. Start with a couple of these from Shoba. They ask, how do you define truth? And how can we build peace in Afghanistan and the rest of the world? So just a small question to start you off.
Yeah, and obviously I do not have those answers. And I think what's valuable is to not think of truth. I don't have a good definition of truth. I think what we can glean from these different individuals that I talked about is that it's something that's evolving. It's not something that's static that we can say this is what truth is. It comes from the pursuit of trying to understand what's the root of the conflict here, where are the injustices, where are people suffering on both sides, because people are not going to be willing to die unless there's a genuine concern that they have. So truth, of course, I don't have a nice, tidy definition of it, which would be great if somebody did, but I think the point that they're making is in any particular conflict, whether it's Afghanistan or any other kind of situation, it requires exploration. It doesn't get solved by simple worldviews, simple descriptions. We really have to explore, and truth then is a process. Truth is something that we seek to find. And in these kinds of conflicts, truth is the underlying roots, the underlying needs that are giving rise to these injustices, these human rights abuses that are manifesting themselves. So sorry, I don't have an answer to how we promote peace in a place like Afghanistan, but I think at least this gives us some kinds of orienting concepts to think about as we move into trying to understand these conflicts.
We have a compliment come through from Andrea. She says, terrific talk, and she appreciates the specific anecdotes. Have a look at the questions that are coming through fast now. Anna asks, do you have any more thoughts on processes of humanization in digital spaces when these are siloed? Should we focus on face-to-face instead?
You know, part of the reason I drew on that Westboro example was because she talked about the contradictions and transforming her own views happening on Twitter, which frankly, for a lot of us, Twitter is a place of hostility. Twitter is a place where all these hostilities of religious, of political, of ideological stripes show up. And it's not often a place where people are genuinely listening to one another. And I found it interesting that she did have that kind of experience. So it's possible, even on social media or on the internet, to find places where that's occurring. Now, it is up against all of these trends where people are primarily interested in debating. There's much more debate, I would venture to say, on places like Twitter or Facebook than there is genuine dialogue, but it is possible. Now, I do think face-to-face dialogue is more powerful because you are experiencing that other person's humanity. I think that was why the sanctuary movement was so effective. You couldn't just write these people off as faceless statistics. We would get reports about the number of people who were killed in these conflicts in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, in Guatemala. But it's a very different thing to have a person sitting in your living room, sitting in your synagogue, and telling you what happened to them, and telling you the roots of this problem. And so I do think it's much like Anne Frank's diary, right? We've all learned about the Holocaust in Western civilization and history classes, and yet there's something about Anne Frank's capacity to describe her life in the midst of that humanized it. She wasn't a faceless statistic, not just one of the millions who died during World War II. Her story has that capacity to help people see the humanity in others. So I do think that that is often more effective than online. And I would place a caveat. There's a lot of research in conflict resolution and peace studies that says, you know, it can't end there. So you've probably heard about peace camps where they bring Palestinian, Israeli, Jewish-Israeli youth together. Or maybe in Cyprus, it's Greek and Turkish Cypriots who come together. And it's designed to have this capacity to tell stories and see the humanity and understand the other side. And what we know from research is that immediately after those kinds of peace camps, those human encounters, people's ideas change. But if you look more longitudinally over time, often they revert back to their original views. And that's because they go back to their communities. Jewish Israelis go back to their communities, Palestinians go to theirs, and they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the kind of cultural support to sustain that. So it's got to be more than just kind of meeting the humanity and hearing each other's story. That's the starting point, I think. But we have to also find ways to keep those contacts going over time so that we're not succumbing to our binary thinking where we just kind of take the line that they're evil and we're on the right side. So hopefully that answered your question somewhat, but I do think it's possible in a variety of venues, not just face-to-face.
I have perhaps two questions here, which I think ask about a similar sort of theme, but in slightly different ways or with different emphases. One's from David and the other's from Helen. So David says, when 2 or 3 religious groups are encountering themselves in conflict, what would be the role of government? And Helen says, encouraged to speak truth to power, speakers of truth are often punished. Non-political forums seem to be the most fertile places to pursue the truth. Would you agree? So we have a question there about the role of governments, and then another question there about, I guess, the opposite of that, which is non-political sorts of forums and what potential that might hold.
Yeah, and again, each conflict is distinct and has its own unique concerns, and so it's not easy to say there's one model that's going to fit all situations. And what we do know is that government can play a constructive role, but it cannot do it without having people at the grassroots level being the ones who are leading those initiatives. So we've seen this in various places, Colombia, where the government comes up with a peace accord. But if it doesn't make sense to the local communities that have to implement it, if it doesn't meet their needs, it's not going to be successful. And so, we have conversations about first track diplomacy and second track diplomacy, and there's roles for different religious actors, as well as different civil society and political actors. So I think the government can play a role, and often it plays a role by providing resources or by providing kind of legislation that can support the changes. However, it can't substitute. If you have a government, if you have a group of politicians who are going to dictate this is the solution, it's bound to have problems because it's got to make sense to the people at the grassroots who have to live it on a daily basis. And that is where we often see religious leaders playing an important role. Not always. Sometimes religious leaders can be in the other side where they're fomenting the conflict, they're fueling the tensions, but sometimes religious leaders can be kind of the brokers that bring moral authority to say, we need to move forward. This is part of what our community's tradition is about. So there are lots of different roles that people can play depending on the circumstances of the conflict. And there's a role for government and politicians to play, but I don't see it as being the leading one other than to kind of stay in the background and to provide the context and the support for it. And I'm sorry, can you read the second question to me again? I'm not sure where that is.
Oh, speaking the truth are often punished. Non-political forums seem to be the most fertile places to pursue the truth.
Well, I think we know that civil society spaces are very, very valuable. And this is why it's a great concern to many of us that civil society spaces tend to be shrinking in this moment. There seems to be a shift towards authoritarianism, towards kind of illiberal policies. But we do know that we need to have those civil society spaces for people to, in some cases, have the free space to come up with their own ideas, to think what it is we want. And different communities can provide that. Again, to talk about the role of religion, if I think about, for example, 1989 in Eastern Europe, in East Germany, it was the East German churches that provided kind of that civil society space. They weren't controlled by the government. It was one of the few free spaces that existed. And that was very, very important, not because the religious leaders were coming up with the solutions or that they were even initiating it. It was simply providing a space in an authoritarian context where very few civil society spaces were free and available to be able to begin building kind of a sense of what forms of resistance people wanted to engage in, what goals they were working towards, how they wanted to implement change, and what their goals were.
A couple of questions coming through about this idea of moral imagination, or about the value sort of system that you need to adopt to move beyond, I guess, a less constructive way of dealing with conflict to a more constructive way, such as you talk about in your lecture. So the questions that are coming through are asking about how you start to create this sort of value system and the skill sets that are required to engage in the sort of dialogue that you're talking about. So, for instance, one of these questions is, there's a lot of emphasis on dialogue, but seldom on skills or training that can better enable dialogue.
Yeah. Yeah. I really thought about this a lot, and I've highlighted the ideas of certain very influential leaders, in part because they're the ones who are articulating these ideas. They're the ones who are demonstrating it. Gandhi spent a lot of time talking about this pursuit of the truth and how this is the way that they were going to fight for British independence from British colonialism. But dialogue is something that isn't a skill you can pick up from simply looking at other people. You're absolutely right. We have to have skills training for it. And I highlighted these leaders, but I recognize that, in fact, this has to happen not at the leadership level, but at the kind of civil society level, that people have to be doing this. And for example, I quoted from Peter Coleman's book where he's talking about different groups that are meeting. He gave the example of pro-life activists and pro-choice activists in Boston who agreed to meet. And this was after actually an abortion clinic bombing, when violence had occurred. And they said, all right, our way of fighting each other isn't constructive. It's led to loss of life, and we need to shift. And it was that kind of serious moment of recognizing how destructive the conflict had become that brought them to the table. And these were activists in grassroots local movements on opposite sides of the issue who started talking. And they had someone there to facilitate it, because we don't see dialogue modeled very often in society. I mean, if you think about our political leaders, if you think about our criminal justice systems, it's predicated on this debate approach. So where do we learn this? We have these leaders that we can look to, but we have to be practicing it at the kind of grassroots community. And I think there's a very important role for people who want to be part of kind of peace building to facilitate dialogue, to build the capacity for people to listen to each other. It's counterintuitive when we're living in cultures that I see right now, so many high conflict cultures that are not listening. We're debating, we're making our points. And so it really is something that's not intuitive to us. It's not something we're seeing modeled very often. We can look to these leaders for models, but we have to begin implementing it at the local level. And it is indeed, I think, one of the most pressing forms of peace work that should be done right now, because it's so foundational and it begins to build a culture. So this moral imagination really is my way of saying, what is the culture? What's the kind of mindset? What's the values that people bring that enable them to bypass this debate, to bypass this dogmatism, to bypass this escalation of conflict? And there's something in those values and that kind of cultural approach that I think is important. So that's what I mean by the moral imagination. What is it in the way that they view people? What is it in the way that they view cultural institutions like religion that can help de-escalate conflicts and promote more constructive outcomes?
I have a question here from Janet. She asks, what about your own native peoples? So many are so wise and makers of shared peace.
And I live in the state of New Mexico, which has one of the highest indigenous rates of the population. It's a very interesting state to live in because it's what we call a minority majority state. So about half the population is Hispanic, about 12% of the population is Native American, only about 35% of the population is white. And so it is a state where people who are historically marginalized are actually in the majority. And Native Americans have tribal governance, they have their own capacity here. And so there is, of course, important things to learn from their traditions. And yet I also recognize part of what we have to do is address the roots of conflict that have caused those communities to be so decimated over time. And they continue to happen. So when COVID happened, Navajo Nation, which spans New Mexico and Arizona and Utah, had the highest rate of COVID infections in the country outside of New York City. They're only about 12% of our population, but at one point they were making up 50% of the COVID infections. And it's because of the legacy of injustice that exists. So many of them are living in areas that are given to kind of tribal governance, but there's not the infrastructure. There's in Navajo Nation, about a third of the people don't even have running water. So when we're talking about basic hygiene of washing your hands frequently, it's not even possible if you're living in a place where that infrastructure isn't available. And the lack of those infrastructural resources is due to this whole history of oppression and injustice. So yes, we have a great deal to learn, but I also think before those communities can be sharing their wisdom, before they can be sharing their insights, we have to do right by them so that they can address just the inequalities that continue to persist in their daily lives, so that they can respond to COVID in a way that is not unequal to what other people can do to try to address escalating COVID rates. So it's both the kind of the immediate learning from them and recognizing that to cultivate an appreciation for their role in cultures and what they bring to peace building efforts means we also have an obligation to address the injustices so they have the capacity to give that to the broader community. So very multi-layered, lots of conflict. Most conflict is just not simple. And so that temptation to want to think about conflict simply really is counterproductive. It doesn't get us to where we need to be. And to learn from other communities means we have to be addressing their needs so that they can come to the table as equals and they can come and have the capacity to share those insights.
So Sharon, we're just coming up to the end of our allotted time, so perhaps one more question. And I'm very sorry to those participants who have written questions that we haven't been able to get to today. So last question. Do you expect, sorry, this one's from Andrea, do you expect more conflict will arise due to climate change and increasing lack of resources such as water and food? How can we proactively humanize diverse populations to prevent this conflict?
As I was putting this presentation together, I thought I'm not even talking about climate change, which perhaps is one of the most pressing issues in the world. And you know, the theme of hope, how do we find hope? How can we talk about hope if our planet is dying? And yet I take some hope from the fact that the recent research on conflict, and there's a lot coming out because we're facing this high conflict, because there's so many kind of cases of toxic polarization, people want to know, what is the way out of this? How do we change these dynamics? And one of the things that some of the conflict resolutions have noted is that really deeply entrenched groups who have intractable conflicts over time often only begin to shift when there's a crisis that affects everybody equally. So if there's an earthquake and now all of a sudden people on all sides of the conflict are concerned just about survival, they often set aside those differences and are willing to work with people and are willing, it's the disruption of kind of normal life that gives them the impetus and gives kind of a motivation to work differently on conflicts. So on the one hand, there's a possibility that we can see beyond our differences to say all of us, regardless of what side of conflicts we're on, regardless of our religious or ethnic or our political or ideological identities, are affected by climate change. This is something that affects all of us. And maybe climate change and climate issues can be that kind of social function of the enemy that I talked about. Maybe it can be that external threat that causes us to put aside our differences and work together. And maybe that in that process, we know that the more lasting peace solutions happen when people work together for outcomes that are mutually beneficial. And all of us are in climate change together. Not to deny that some people are much more affected by it than others, but all of us have to work together. So my hope is that climate change will become that kind of jolting crisis that leads us to say, enough bickering about this ideological idea or that, we have to work together because there is an external threat that's going to affect all of us. And we have the benefit, if we can work together, of changing this. So it's a very optimistic approach, but I think something like that has to happen where we have that external threat that brings us together at a time when there's so many divisions.
I think we could all do with a bit of that optimism, Sharon, that we've had. So thank you so much for that. We're getting lots of lovely thank you comments coming through from people. So I see they've enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Appreciate it.